Please welcome Tim Miller, Amie Parnes, Richard North Patterson, and our moderator, Patt Morrison.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Here are a couple of the books that are going to be discussed today with our panel. As you just heard, Tim Miller, Amie Parnes, and Richard North Patterson. The 2016 presidential election was certainly one for the books, and it may be one for the couches, because we're going to try to psychoanalyze ourselves for the next 100 years about what happened in this election, and psychoanalyze the candidates as well. So I'd like to start with Mr. Patterson, who wrote a running blog for the Huffington Post during the election, and then went back and annotated it with where he got it wrong, where he got it right. And I must say, as I read this, it was like those horror novels, that creeping sense of the awful that comes up upon you. Was that your feeling I sensed in this?
Well, first of all, people ask me why I don't write fiction anymore, and really, why bother? The 2016 campaign really rendered fiction redundant. Yeah, I had that same feeling at the time that I couldn't believe what was happening. At the same time, you realize there was something really unique going on in this campaign that we hadn't seen, and a couple of things. One was the coming apart of a major political party and its reassembly on a candidate who came in from the outside. And I remember I was telling Tim Miller earlier, I know Jeb Bush. I thought he was a very admirable guy. And I talked to a leading pollster in 2015, well before the primary season. He said, he's dead. I said, why? He said, because the base is so angry. And I thought about that. And I realized that for years that the Republican base had been the sort of rickety coalition of evangelicals, foreign policy conservatives, and economic conservatives, but there were a lot of ordinary middle-class folks who were being told that a lot of their problems had to do with Washington and the establishment. Well, then they became to wonder whether the establishment wasn't the very people who had been telling them this stuff. And so by the beginning of 2016, it became pretty clear to me, shockingly, I thought, that the only people that could possibly win that nomination were Trump and Cruz. And then there was the phenomenon of Trump. And he was the ultimate media figure in a way. There's a survey done by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard that showed that he'd gotten $3 billion of free media before the primary season even started. They just basically gave him an open mic. And so you would turn on CNN, it was like an infomercial, completely unfiltered. And, there's this, all this stuff now about the media is down in Trump. That is certainly true to a large degree, but that marks a transition from the real feeling that a lot of people have in cable news that, this guy's news and this guy's revenue. If we give him an open mic, then people are going to be watching us.
And free programming.
And free programming. The other thing, and I will just say this, it was fascinating. Trump, to me, was a unique figure. Not simply because he came in from the outside, but because you had to find an organizing principle for which would explain him. And I'll just say, I'm sure there are people of all political stripes here. Anyone who's read my column sort of knows where I stand on all of this. So I'll try to be gentle. But I thought that it didn't do to put Trump in the normal analytic boxes. Well, he's a populist, or he's an insurrectionist, or he's an entertainer,
or an arsonist,
or he's a strategist, or even tactician. Because none of those things explain all the things that he did. I thought the only thing that did explain him was a particular sort of psychological force field that he had that explained the lashing outs, the anger, the changes of mind, the changes of story, the punching down at people like Judge Curiel. All that kind of stuff could not be explained in normal political terms or strategic terms or anything like that. It was about Trump. And so I concluded that one of the real stories was not what this guy said or what people said about him in terms of his political positioning, but who he was as a human being and a character. And I wrote pretty clearly what I thought. Lots of people were unhappy with me. They said I'd overstepped, stepping into personal psychology. But I think now for a year we've watched him as president. And we realize that we are in the hands of a very unique personality, and I think that is the big story. He's not going to be any different than he was. He's not going to be more presidential or this or that. He's not going to be more predictable. He's going to be Trump, and that's the deal we got.
Amie Parnes is co-author of the book Shattered. She'd written an earlier book about Hillary Clinton and is senior White House correspondent for The Hill. And Amie, as I read your book, I thought of something that happened in August of '79 when Roger Mudd of CBS News interviewed Ted Kennedy and put to him the simple question, why do you want to be president? And Ted Kennedy couldn't answer it. Yeah. And here we have Hillary Clinton, who, had she gotten to the White House, we know pretty much what she would have done. She would have been very good at it because she knew about all this stuff, but that was the one question she seemed not to be able to articulate an answer to, which ended up being the stumbling block.
Yeah, and she had 8 years to kind of learn her message or kind of figure out what happened and rework her campaign and structure it. And so my co-author and I we came out of our last book and wanted to answer questions like, what did she learn from her last campaign? What would she improve? And she did try to fix things in a lot of ways, but she also made the same mistakes. And one of the largest mistakes that we found is that she didn't articulate a message. She couldn't tell people why me, why now. And she was hit kind of with this wave of populism. Bernie Sanders, and on the other side of the aisle, Donald Trump, and people. I went to both rallies, and Bernie Sanders rallies. They were like electric, and people kind of knew why he was running. He catered a lot of it to younger folks. They wanted free college. With Trump, people thought, if you still ask people what he stood for at the time, they'll tell you he wants to build a wall, he is for America first. They could tell you what he was about. And with Hillary Clinton, even now, when we talk to a lot of the people around her at the top levels of her campaign, they still couldn't tell you why she wanted to be president and why she was running. And I think that was probably one of the biggest detriments to her campaign, that she couldn't really articulate why me and why now.
One of the accusations is her inauthenticity. And I covered Hillary in '92 when Bill Clinton was running. I found her to be very authentic, but unable to come across as authentic, which is a different thing altogether.
Yeah, and everyone has a kind of fun story about her behind the scenes. When you talk to people who know her
in the girls' bathroom, for example.
Yeah, and they all say she's really funny and really smart and really, she's got this wicked sense of humor, but for whatever reason, she just doesn't want people to see that side of her publicly. And so that was always a problem for her campaign. I think her campaign officials wanted to, they kept trying to make her kind of fun and gregarious, and they even sort of telegraphed that at one point. There was a New York Times story that said, post Labor Day, when things were really starting to matter, there was a story that said her campaign was going to roll out the funny, likable Hillary Clinton, which I think a lot of people found a little contrived. And I know a lot of donors were really upset about that story.
It's like Richard Nixon going on Laugh-In?
Yeah, exactly. And so we were hearing from a lot of those people at the time, why would they roll that out? And in retrospect, I think a lot of people internally found that to be a really big unforced error.
Do you think, had she been more able to be forthcoming, that the issues that became so large in her campaign, like the emails, that she would have just swatted them out of the park? Had she been able to be upfront about things?
It's hard to say. We think that it took her 6 months essentially to actually admit that she had made a mistake with the email server. And there was a huge kind of internal battle in her campaign about whether or not she come out and kind of acknowledge that she shouldn't have done that. And she and her husband, the former president, never felt like they had done anything wrong. So internally, you had people like John Podesta saying, come out there and apologize and own that mistake. And you had she and her husband, they were kind of throwing their hands up in the air going, why? But we didn't do anything. And so, but when you think about it in retrospect, the entire 6 months of that campaign, even before her campaign started, was dominated by the email headlines. So I think it just added to the whole perception of what else are they hiding, and that was a big factor in the campaign.
Can I just say on the emails just briefly that this is the thing. And the email scandal obviously ended up getting blown way out of proportion. But the genesis of the email scandal was Hillary's fear of the Freedom of Information Act requests. It was a transparency issue. That's why she used a server that was off of the public government servers, because she didn't want all of her correspondence to be able to become public, right? And so it was right, and so that is the core sin of hers. Was
Yeah,
the
I often say she likes to live her very public life privately, or she wants to.
So, Tim, we had a Republican establishment that simply didn't know what to do with or about Donald Trump, because he didn't play by any of the rules they observed. Even when it came to fundraising, he said, I'm a rich guy, I don't need anybody else's money, but we didn't see his own money getting put into this campaign. And so to debate a man like this, to run a campaign against a man like this, as Hillary Clinton found out in the general, the Republicans found out in the primary, where it was like, somebody said it was like trying to debate Jell-O. It was all over the place. So how did the Republican establishment, which in many cases its members did not endorse the nominee,
Yep.
Republican newspapers did not endorse the nominee, how did this get away from them?
Well, I can speak about it on the micro level in my role as communications director for Jeb. I think that he was, like Hillary in many ways, uniquely ill-suited to debate him, on the debate stage. And I think that these debates, turned into Super Bowl level kind of media environments because of Trump and the kind of expecting the unexpected. I don't think in any past debates there was any chance somebody might, bring up the size of their private parts on the debate stage. Donald Trump did that. And so that created a lot of interest, right? And
he had a chart, right?
Yeah, exactly. Somebody like Jeb, who is in demeanor much more like his father, than his brother was, wanted to debate the finer points of policy, just like Hillary did, and that got completely steamrolled by Trump. And so I think his style. Who
didn't know the finer points.
No, it didn't care, right? And so Trump's style played to his benefit because he was basically playing a game, as you said, where the rules didn't apply to him. There were 16 people on stage playing within one rules, and Trump was playing within others. I think Marco got the closest, but it was too late to trying to realize how to kind of play Trump's game in those very, very late debates. But at that point, kind of the narrative had already been set, the public image of Marco had been set. Strategically speaking, big picture, the big problem with the Republican establishment was not taking Trump seriously until it was too late. There was basically the working theory in every individual campaign was, every individual establishment campaign was, we need to beat you, the other establishment guys, and then once we beat you, we'll deal with the idiot, right? When it's just two of us left.
It's like Charlton Heston in the chariot race in Ben-Hur, right?
Sure. Yeah, and so the game theory of this kind of worked out poorly, and Trump needed to be dealt with earlier, and because Jeb was the first victim of Trump's kind of branding skills, his first personal attacks, I think we realized the soonest that he needed to be dealt with head on. But Jeb, as I said, was not particularly well suited to take him on. And I think by the time some of the more skilled debaters were, Trump's position had been set, and it was learning the wrong lessons from the 2012 campaign, where we'd seen Michelle Bachmann go up to first place and then collapse, and Herman Cain, and I think everybody expected that to happen with Trump, and it didn't. And by the time he was taken seriously, he had already had a plurality support. And I think the last thing that the establishment consultants and candidates did not realize was just how genuine a lot of that support came from and how visceral it was. In candor, I didn't even really realize that in the ultimate self-importance act, I re-listened to a podcast that I did 2 weeks after the election where I gave my opinion on why Jeb lost. And over the hour, I didn't talk about the sort of anger and the grievance that the Republican voters had against cultural elites, against the media, against political elites, and Trump tapped into that in such though he was faking it in a lot of ways, but it felt authentic, and I think that while mentally the candidate, the other establishment candidates and consultants realized that on an emotional level, they didn't connect to it.
I'd like to ask all of you about what we're hearing about the base and the anger, because in the early days of this particular election, the primary, I would ask people, interview people who were angry, and I'd say, what are you angry about? What is it you can't do now after 8 years of Obama that you could do before, or vice versa? And they didn't have an answer. It was just this kind of vague anger at everything that had gone wrong, but no sense of where it was coming from. Richard, you were very much on point about that.
Yeah, I think it's profoundly cultural. I mean, I think if you ask a lot of Trump voters about issues, you would hear generally what Tim cited, which is, the broad themes. But basically there's an anger, a cultural anger, an anger at East and West Coast elites, which transcends any issue. It's the feeling they're being condescended to, the feeling that they're powerless, the feeling that people are looking over them, and the feeling that this Bronx billionaire somehow speaks for them. Yeah, it was interesting listening to Tim about the circular firing squad among the establishment. It was certainly right. But I sat there in December and looked at the map of the Republican primaries, which went through the South pretty quickly after Iowa and New Hampshire. I was trying to figure out how the hell Kasich, Rubio, Christie, or anybody, even if they killed off the others, was going to run that map. And I couldn't see it because you're running right through evangelical territory. If you go to the South, that I was recently, they really believe there's a war on Christmas. Okay? They really believe that there's a mass effort to sort of repress, good, straightforward Christian observation and worship. I don't know where the hell that is happening, but they really, for that, that's really very real. So I just couldn't see how you could, as a Republican, bridge this burning anger. And now you look at Trump voters, I mean, we live in different realities. The issues that blue people and red people feel are important are different. If you look at the map, 16% of American counties were carried by Hillary, 84% were carried by Trump. It's demographic sorting. It's different sources of information. And I think what Trump really exposed is a lot of us sort of bright people who think we know stuff didn't realize how much alienation there was in the country and how much alienation there was, frankly, toward folks like us.
Can I just say really quick on that alienation? And it's your cultural point, just on a finer point. It is also, it's not just political, right? It's the media, it's an entertainment media, right? I do feel like these working class white voters feel like your point about being condescended, they're being mocked. If you watch television shows, if you watch movies, if you watch CNN, if you watch anything except for Fox or Duck Dynasty, right? Seriously, your culture is being mocked, and the heroes in these shows are increasingly minorities and gays and young people and urban hipsters, and there is not, and there's a feeling that the society that their kids are growing up in is completely different than theirs, and I totally agree that was as much. If not more than the economic and more political issues, with the exception of people in certain areas of the country that are really economically depressed, coal country and things of that nature.
Let me ask Amie a question about that, because we saw in the Democratic convention, and it was criticized for this, you saw a lot of people of color speak, you saw them in the audience, you saw young people, you saw gay people. You had the Bernie bros as a very angry portion of that, and I want you to speak to what they were angry about. Mm-hmm. But you also didn't see the kind of blue-collar lunch pail worker that the Democrats had traditionally gone to. Right. I talked to Joe Biden a couple of weeks ago, and he said that when Obama recruited him, he wanted him for Pennsylvania, for Wisconsin, for Michigan, for the very states that were the blue wall that you referred to, right, that Hillary Clinton lost.
Right, and they had a campaign strategy that if she actually if she kind of emulated what Obama did and went to the cities and spoke to the cities mostly, she could win the map. And so if you'll recall, at the very end of the campaign, they weren't really going to places like Wisconsin or Michigan. They were trying to expand the map because they thought that they were going to win.
Arizona? Really?
Yeah. They thought they could win in Arizona and Utah and possibly even Georgia. There was talk of that in the final days. And so they send her to Arizona. They send Michelle Obama to Arizona. They're really thinking that she's going to win, and not only is she going to win, but she's going to win by such a large mandate that she's going to go into office, and she's going to be able to use that as leverage. And so I think a lot of it is sort of, in hindsight, they're trying to kind of rewrite history and saying, no, we actually, knew that it would be closer in these states, but I don't think that's true. And, the fact of the matter is she was supposed to go to Wisconsin and campaign with President Obama, and that event was scrapped, and they went to, because of Orlando, the tragedy in Orlando, and they never went back there. They went to North Carolina instead. So I think that is kind of like a telltale sign of where they thought they were, that they didn't really even need to go to Wisconsin. But what's funny about that is Bill Clinton all along was kind of sounding the alarm and saying, you need to send me to the suburbs, you need to send me to these areas where I won. He sensed something was kind of amiss on the ground, and he thought that he could kind of remedy it. And so in retrospect, I think he feels a little bit vindicated by that sense of something amiss.
What about the Bernie bros? Because in many cases, as I sensed in your book and as I was reading, they epitomized a lot of the sexism that manifested itself against Hillary Clinton. And that people were shopping around for an excuse like the emails to say, oh, I'm not voting against her because she's a woman, I'm voting against her because of the emails or whatever. Yeah. So this is a different kind of anger. Yeah. And I want to know where the source of that anger. It's not what Richard and Tim were talking about. It's a different kind of alienation.
Yeah, but it wasn't just them. I mean, the funniest part is that I know a lot of millennials who were Bernie Sanders supporters who never came around for her. She never was able to
Did they vote for Trump?
They sat home. And I've spoken to a lot of them.
Gary Johnson.
Yeah, or Gary Johnson. And, one of the most interesting storylines I found in reporting this election was that millennial women didn't feel the need to support her. And when I talked to them, they often said, oh, well, we'll see another woman president in our lifetimes. We just don't like her in particular. And they felt no need to vote for a woman. So it was all these different factors, I think. It wasn't just the Bernie bros. It was everything. It was, the fact that she thought that she could just win based on, the minority vote and winning Hispanics and African Americans.
For all of you, I was surprised that the Russian interference, which came out during the campaign, was not a bigger issue. Russia has been our enemy for almost 100 years. The idea that there'd be any collusion with Russia, these are the people who are out to get us, the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan called them. Why didn't that make a mark? Why didn't that register with voters?
Briefly, I think indifference, because such is the separation that the Russia thing, which would have been toxic maybe 10 years ago, was just fake news, just an excuse to badmouth Trump. I mean, we look at things now. This is played out now a year and a half later, or 14 months later. We know all sorts of stuff about Mike Flynn and what the president knew then. We know all sorts of stuff about meetings that they then denied that we now know happened. I mean, no campaign in history had as much involvement with a foreign adversary as this group of folks did. And yet, in terms of Trump's base, that doesn't penetrate. Such is the sort of intellectual bubble in which our segments of people live, that it simply become non-permeable. So I think it didn't register, not because it wouldn't have been serious before, but because the level of commitment to Trump was such that, you just reject that which is unpleasant to hear.
I think there were two other factors. One is the type of voter that would have been impacted by this is really me, right? It's the Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush Republican, kind of traditional Republican voter that still, is for aggressive foreign policy, has hostility towards Russia. And I think for the vast majority of the voters at the end of the day, it just came down to their personal loathing for Hillary Clinton, like they could not get over. And there were just not very many Republican, traditional Republicans who did not like Trump, who did not like the Russia connections, that at the end of the day, it just was not as important as their distaste for Hillary Clinton and a variety of other kind of issues, whether it be sort of abortion, economic issues, et cetera. That was part of it. I do think there was also a media criticism here when it comes to Russia. Obviously, the media, generally was hostile towards Trump. I think that goes without saying. But I do think that they did two things to help him. One, which you mentioned earlier, was the wall-to-wall coverage during the primary. The second thing was the coverage of the WikiLeaks hacks was wildly irresponsible, and the Podesta emails, and had a Russian, KGB operative broken into John Podesta's house, gone into his drawer, taken his diary out, and given it to the New York Times, the tone they would have used in that coverage would have been totally different than what they did, which was hack into his emails. Or there would not have been coverage at all. Right, yeah, and they would have either decided not to cover it, or they would have covered it in the context of this is, it is just completely outrageous and outlandish that the Russians would have done this. But there's something about the digital and the hacking of it, and the fact that people weren't sure that it was Russia, and WikiLeaks has a lot of credibility with reporters that they've gained, which was unearned. And I think that the coverage of the daily drip of the Podesta emails was totally irresponsible, and it was covered in a way that made people actually more mad at Hillary than really caring about the Russian interference.
Amie, you describe, these were very memorable presidential debates, and you describe the training of Hillary Clinton for these, and the debates were memorable in so many ways because there's no question by everybody who scores like Olympic judges that she won all three debates. That didn't make any difference. There were incidents where Trump called her a nasty woman, essentially stalked up behind her on camera. Why wasn't she prepared for any of this with all the debate preparation that she underwent?
Well, I think there's kind of a double standard when it comes to Hillary Clinton, and she felt like if she kind of overstepped that line, if she told him to back off, and you kind of sense that regret now in her book, where she would have told him, or she thought that she wanted to tell him to back off, and she wanted to tell him what's what. But if she would have done that there would have been this uproar, and people would have believed in that kind of that stereotype of this nasty Hillary Clinton. So I think she was trained to kind of, one of her aides actually in one of the prep sessions followed her around and stalked her and, gave her hugs, and made her feel like very uncomfortable on purpose. They knew that this was a possibility. They prepped for the fact that Trump would talk about Bill Clinton's past and his affairs. So they knew all this was coming. They just didn't want her. They felt like if she was the smartest person in the room and the most presidential, that she would win. And I think, inarguably, she did win. She was the most prepared, but it's not really what mattered. But that's Hillary Clinton in a nutshell. She feels like if she's the most prepared, if she's the most studious, she will inevitably win, but that's sort of not what people wanted. It kind of goes against, the whole thing of, I think this whole election was kind of thrown off in that way.
Well, and that's the point for me to ask a last question of each on the panel before we go to the questions from the audience, and that is, and I'll start with Tim, was this election an aberration or was it a template for the future?
Neither. It was a long way coming, at least in the Republican Party in the primary. I think that people look back at, Buchanan in '88, right? Like this started a long time ago.
I thought you meant James Buchanan.
The populist, kind of, if you sort of imagine two snowballs going down a hill, Buchanan was this small snowball, and the populist wing, which grew into the Tea Party, continued to get bigger, and sort of the old Poppy Bush wing, kept getting smaller. And so, in that sense, I don't think it was an aberration, and I also don't think it was an aberration that we will see celebrity candidates with personal brands, particularly in the internet era, democratization of news, who can kind of break through with their own personal brand. Obama was that in a sense, just not in the same way as Trump. So but I also don't think that we're now going into a future where it's going to be like, Kanye versus Kid Rock in 2024,
or
right?
Oprah.
Right, yeah, Oprah. I mean, maybe there could be other celebrity candidates that do well, but I don't think that this is a complete template for going forward.
Amie?
It's hard to say because we just talked about Oprah, and when the potential possibility of a candidacy kind of erupted a couple of weeks ago, I was hearing from a lot of people who were really excited by that. And I found that to be really odd, because I thought in the era of Trump, shouldn't the pendulum kind of traditionally swing in the other direction? But I think a lot of donors in particular that I've been talking to, people who really, top donors, have said, no, this is kind of what we need. The party needs some excitement right now. But I think a lot of it is also because the party is leaderless right now, and they're kind of looking for that energy and they can't find it. And there's not that one candidate that everyone's sort of rallying behind at this point. It's still early, but there's no Obama kind of waiting in the wings. There's not that one candidate. So I think that's why you've seen a lot of people kind of reach back for the Obama days, and they want Obama and they want Biden to be an active part of the party. And there's a little bit of hesitance, particularly on Obama's part, to kind of to reemerge because the party kind of needs some new leadership to kind of bubble up.
Well, and Obama is not electable constitutionally, and so he would only be a rival to whoever would be the true party standard bearer, I guess.
Right, but there's no one clear
Right.
person who will fill that void.
Right. Richard?
Well, you know, I think there are certain ways in which we're not going back. I mean, Obama was, you know, a 2-year senator when he declared. He was a bright, shiny object. I happen to think he's very admirable in lots of ways, but he was not classically prepared for president. Trump even less so. And I think there's an underlying sort of magical thinking. I call it the democratization of ignorance, where everyone's opinion is as good as everyone else's. All you have to do is assert it. And that's Trump. He asserted he was an expert on things that no one could be an expert for. And true genius is knowing the affinity of things you don't know, which has never occurred to him. And I don't think that we are going back to looking for statespeople who are well qualified if we ever did. I mean, Jack Kennedy had 14 years in Congress, we forget. Obama had basically 2 when he declared. And now we're talking about rookie senators. So I worry that we are now devaluing the kind of expertise in politics that we need to have leadership. The other thing is just the sheer nastiness of it. I don't think we're putting civility back in the bottle anymore. And I've been watching the Republican Party trying to figure out who is the successor to Trump, should there be a vacancy, or should we be looking into 2024. And I think it's Tom Cotton, probably, and he's pretty nasty. And he doesn't bother not to be, and he's very hard-edged. And I think he, more than Cruz, is sort of positioning himself to inherit a kind of Trumpism. So I think we are in for more unpleasantness. I wish I thought that there were people going to appeal to the center and with a broad message, but we are more and more trying to turn out our people, and that does not speak well for a moderate, civilized dialogue going forward.
So let's do some questions. Here's how it's going to work. You're going to raise your hand. I will call on you. You will state your question, not a speech. If you want to run for office, Tim can help you out here. And then I will repeat your question for our audio here, and then we'll address it to the panel. So, yes, right here.
Yes,
You need to speak to me, because I'll be repeating your question.
in response to what you said, Mr. Patterson, regarding looking towards 2024, do you think the Republicans will wait until 2024, or do you think there will be a slate of challengers, perhaps in 2020, that
Okay.
willing to
Let me repeat that. It's a good question whether or not there will be any challengers in 2020 to Donald Trump, or what the slate might look like there, or in 2024 if Trump is reelected and there are new figures for the Republican leadership.
Well, Tim and Amie will certainly have a view of this. I've seen polling which suggests that there is no Republican right now that can come anywhere close to Trump. So it looks to me that unless you want to run a long-shot campaign, because that's the only shot in life you've got, maybe John Kasich would, then if you're seriously thinking about a future in the Republican Party, you would be daunted by the prospect of running against Trump, because even if you manage to win, the legacy of bitterness would be such, given the obduracy of his support. I think it would be very difficult. So what do you guys think?
I suspect that there will be a primary against him. It will be a quixotic primary. You never know in politics. Nothing is crazier than the guy from The Apprentice being the president. So, anything could happen. And so I think that someone will run on the basis of anything can happen, taking a moral stand against President Trump, and Thirdly, you become very famous and can come do these sorts of panels and stuff and get paid and be on boards, right, if you run against him and lose. So Trump is, to just put in perspective on whether that will likely be successful, Trump today is in a stronger position than George W. Bush was with the Republican primary electorate at the same time during W's first term. Actually, if you go right before 9/11, right after 9/11, it's sort of, that isn't an apples-to-apples comparison. And you would have been thought crazy if on September 10th, 2001, to say somebody might primary George Bush. And so if you look at the numbers, that's really the state of play.
Amy?
I think someone like Kasich, maybe. I keep hearing
Like
that,
who?
like John Kasich, could emerge, and I think there's a lane for that. I know a lot of Republicans are kind of, I mean, you might disagree with me, and you probably know these people, but I think there's a lane for someone like him to run, and there are a lot of people. There's some nods in the audience, or
There's a lane, it's just not a big
Yeah.
enough one.
yeah,
It's a bike path.
yeah.
More like
Let-
a cul-
Okay.
more like a
I'll
cul-
support him, but
Yeah.
there's not
it's
enough
it's
of
a
me.
cul-de-sac, I think,
Yeah.
not a lane.
Before we go back to the audience, I want to follow up quickly with a question for Tim. Are there Republican voters or Trump and Republican voters? Because there are some people who I think may sit out an election if it's not Trump or someone like him.
Yeah, there's both. I guess my point is the traditional Republican base voter. I think that a lot of people in the media and kind of in elite circles get the sense that there are more Republicans who hate Trump than there are, because the 2% of Republicans that hate Trump are the people that go to parties where rich people go to and famous people go to, right? Like those are the two. Like that's it. And so there just aren't that many. There is the Republican base in Trump is the same. There is another category of voter, which is why Trump won, that put him over the top, which are these kind of Perot voters, people in rural Pennsylvania that were going to not vote if it was Hillary versus Jeb that came out for Trump. That is a separate category of voter, but the Republican base is pretty much Trump at this point.
There's a question back here. Yes, let's do right here. Speak to me, please, so I can repeat.
Why is it that the political consultants were so wrong and so ignorant of what was going on in the feeling of the country and the feeling of the voters? They collected a lot of money, but they didn't seem to know what the hell was going on.
I'll field
Question
that.
is,
I'll field that
let me
one.
repeat the question, please. The question is why political consultants with their big paychecks, most of them, present company excluded, I'm sure, why they got it so wrong, why they didn't see it coming.
Yeah, I had to volunteer for Jeb the last few months, so I didn't get paid that much, but I did all right. We got it wrong for two reasons. One was the bubbles that we were talking about. All the political consultants are in the same bubbles that the media is in, right? There aren't any political consultants who live in Little Rock, right? They all live in Washington, and so I think that there was even a lag among people who are experts in understanding the feeling among voters outside of kind of the pockets of prosperity in this country. That's part of it. And secondly is, there's a lot of, people want to act like that they're experts in a lot of things. I mean, just look at why didn't any of the financial experts know that the market crash was going to come? A lot of things, happen on the margins. Trump lost the popular vote, right? Trump got a plurality of the vote in the primary, and had he had a one-on-one versus just maybe Marco and Trump from the start, Marco would have beaten him, right? The problem was the way that things played out. So, I think that Republican consultants deserve criticism for losing touch with the base voter for sure. But I think that Trump also, kind of caught lightning in a bottle.
I would also say you can never talk to a group of Republican donors without emerging a little dumber than you were when you went in the room. And I think a lot of consultants talk to a lot of donors, and that's not a source of infinite political wisdom.
Hands here, yes, here. What are the chances
Zero.
that Donald Trump will be impeached?
Zero.
Not much. Not much.
Not zero. There's no zero, I guess, in the world, but very, very little. And the Republican Congress is not going to impeach him, period. Like they will not.
Follow-up, what is
So
the
the
chance
Democrats could win and then try to impeach him, but
What is the chance he'll be indicted? Higher?
I'd say a little higher.
a little higher. But again, he can only be removed through impeachment which is a political,
Right.
which is
And
like
not a
impeachment is not a legal. No matter your view on whether Robert Mueller will uncover something, like impeachment is not a legal matter; it's a political matter. There needs to be the political will to impeach. So he can break no laws and get impeached, or he could break all the laws and not get impeached. So unless Congress flips to such a degree that he's impeachable, we're with him until.
And that's a 2/3 vote, as I recall.
Yeah, exactly.
Down here.
On election night, I think Democrats and Republicans were shocked over the outcome of the election. And I just wonder, was there more reasons, or what reasons the pollsters, I mean, people lied to the pollsters, and I don't know if I'm right, that they were embarrassed to say they were voting for Trump because they were attacked if they said so.
Okay, this is the question about the pollsters and why it looked so wrong up to election night. Both sides were shocked, including, as Amie writes in her book, not only Clinton, but the Trump campaign was astonished to be elected to the White House. So why wasn't that, the pollsters, the people who came out and talked to voters, why was that so wrong?
I don't know. Maybe some people lied to
Somebody-
pollsters, but two things happened, though, for sure. One, a pollster named Ed Goaz, so I like to give him credit, but he's on Fox sometimes. He told me on the Sunday before the election that Trump was going to win for the reason that he said that in the last week, this election had unprecedented number of people who hated both. Usually it's 4% or lower who hate both. In this election, it was 18 to 20%, depending on the poll, that hated both. Of those 18 to 20%, they all decided late, and they went 3-1 for Trump.
Okay, and Amie, do you have a?
Well,
Take
I
on
know
that.
that on the Democratic side, Hillary's campaign just gave up on traditional polling, and they relied specifically on data analytics. So in states like Michigan, in particular, they never did traditional polling in the final 3 weeks of the campaign. And what was fascinating was I was sitting in the Javits Center that night in the press file as the results were coming in, and I was texting and emailing with a lot of people internally on the Clinton campaign, and I sent a message, because of course my editor was like, find out what's happening and what's the mood and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm sitting there, and this top official actually admitted that to me and said, we never saw this coming. And that was sort of the moment I knew that she was going to lose. It was around 10 o'clock that night.
Okay. I'm sorry,
yeah.
we've only got 2 minutes left. I'd like to get one last question. You've been raising your hand.
I don't understand how Hillary Clinton was viscerally loathed by so many people that absolutely hated her. I understand, disagree with her politics. Is that because she's a woman or her history, or would that be possible without Fox News?
The question is the forces that were essentially arrayed against Hillary Clinton and how it was possible that someone who seemed strongly positioned could have.
It's a really complicated question, and I think one that we'll never really know. People really just have a visceral reaction to her. Either you really like her or you don't like her. And I think a lot of people just didn't like her, and I think she kind of underestimated. She, as I said before, felt like if she was the smartest person, if she could prove that she could be presidential, she would win. And she didn't quite understand. And one of the most fascinating things that I think we reported in our book was that she actually didn't really understand what was happening in the electorate. And there's a scene in the book where she's confiding to an advisor and she's saying, I don't really understand. They're on a plane and she's saying, I don't really understand what's happening right now with the electorate. And the fact that she couldn't really understand, she knew that people didn't really like her, but the fact that she didn't quite get it kind of played a role in that whole thing.
And let's give a last quick comment to Richard
Well,
here before
very
we
quickly,
wrap up.
the word Comey's not been mentioned, and there were many causes of Hillary Clinton's defeat, but that was perhaps the ultimate one, because the Comey thing was the iron filings which attracted all the bad feeling about Clinton. It was way overdone in the press, but nonetheless there was that. And so I think that was a further excuse for people to stay home or to vote for Trump. I mean, I don't think it'd be underrated. I mean, we came off 3 compelling presidential debate performances. She was sailing along, and Comey stopped that dead. And that story stopped it dead. I talked to people from both campaigns, and they said, yeah, it's different out there.
So I'd like you to thank the panel. The book signings are yonder, and you can speak to them there.